The Grand Military Academy floated in the darkness of space like a giant metal city. It was built near a dying red star, and its black walls stretched for miles in every direction. Inside those walls, young soldiers from 17 different alien species learned how to fight, how to lead, and how to survive. David Park was one of the few humans at the academy. He was 22 years old, with short black hair and tired eyes that always seemed to be thinking about something. He had come from Earth 3 years ago, one of the first humans to join the Galactic Coalition's military training program. Most aliens thought humans were too young as a species, too primitive, too emotional. But David had proven himself smart enough to earn a spot. On this particular morning, David walked into Training Chamber 7 with the other cadets. The room was massive, with seats rising up like a stadium. Strange lights floated near the ceiling, and the walls showed images of distant galaxies. David took his usual seat in the back row, pulling out his datapad to take notes. The other cadets filled the room with noise. The Phanari, who looked like tall purple octopuses, whispered to each other with their tentacles. The Growth, massive rock-like beings with glowing eyes, sat perfectly still and hummed low sounds. The Velkai, thin creatures with silver skin and 4 arms, argued about something in their clicking language. Then Instructor Velmer entered, and everyone went silent. Velmer was not like any living thing David had ever seen. His body was made entirely of crystal, clear and bright like a diamond. He stood 8 feet tall, and when he moved, light bent around him in strange ways. He was over 600 years old and had fought in wars that happened before humans had even discovered fire. Every cadet in the room feared him and respected him in equal measure. "Today," Velmer said, his voice coming from everywhere at once, "we will discuss death." David leaned forward slightly. This was not a normal lesson. Not the death of soldiers, Velmer continued. Not the death of ships or planets. Today we discuss the death of reality itself. The floating lights dimmed, and a hologram appeared in the center of the room. It showed a patch of empty space, peaceful and quiet. Then, without warning, the space began to twist. It folded in on itself like paper being crumpled. Colors that should not exist flashed across the image. And then there was nothing. Just a hole where the universe used to be. "The void collapse," Velmer announced. "The most dangerous phenomenon in known existence." David's hand moved across his datapad, recording everything. Around him, the other cadets shifted nervously. Even the Growth had stopped humming. "A void collapse occurs when the fabric of space becomes unstable," Velmer explained. "The cause is unknown. It can happen anywhere, at any time. When sensors detect the beginning of a collapse, you have exactly 43 seconds before everything within its radius is erased from existence." One of the Phanari raised a tentacle. "Instructor, what is the survival rate?" "If you are within the radius when it completes," Velmer said flatly, "the survival rate is 0. You do not die. You simply cease to exist. Your atoms are not destroyed. They are removed from reality entirely." The room was completely silent now. David could hear his own heartbeat. "In 10,000 years of recorded galactic history," Velmer continued, "the void collapse has killed approximately 47 million sentient beings. It has destroyed 2,000 ships, 14 space stations, and 3 inhabited moons." David raised his hand. A few of the alien cadets turned to look at him with surprise. Humans rarely spoke in Velmer's classes. "Yes, Cadet Park?" Velmer's crystal body turned toward him. "What is the defensive protocol?" David asked. "How do we protect ourselves?" Velmer was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried something that might have been sadness. "There is no defensive protocol, Cadet. No weapon can prevent a void collapse. No shield can stop it. No technology in the known galaxy can even slow it down. Then what do we do? David pressed. You run, Velmer said simply. The moment sensors detect a collapse, you have 43 seconds to evacuate the area. Our fastest ships can sometimes escape if they are at the very edge of the radius. But if you are near the center, there is nothing to do but accept your fate. David frowned. Has anyone ever tried to stop it? Around him, several alien cadets made sounds of discomfort. The Velkai clicked their tongues in what David knew was disapproval. One of the Growth actually turned to stare at him, its glowing eyes bright with surprise. Velmer's crystal body flickered, light bending strangely around his form. For a moment, David thought the instructor might be angry. But when Velmer spoke, his voice was calm. May have tried. Cadet Park. The Fenari Empire spent 300 years and unlimited resources attempting to find a solution. The ancient ones, who built the first starships, dedicated entire generations to the problem. Even the architects, the oldest species in the coalition, eventually accepted that some things cannot be fought. But has anyone actually figured out how it works? David asked. The mechanism behind it? Now Velmer moved closer, his massive crystal form casting rainbow shadows across the seats. The other cadets leaned away, but David stayed perfectly still. The void collapse has a focal point, Velmer said slowly. A single location in space where the instability begins. This point exists for exactly 1 microsecond before the collapse expands. Theoretically, if one could strike this point with enough force at precisely the right moment, the collapse might be disrupted. So it is possible, David said. No, Velmer replied firmly. It is not. The calculations required would take longer than the 43 seconds you have. The weapon needed does not exist. The precision required is beyond any targeting system ever created. It is not possible, Cadet. It has never been possible. It will never be possible. David nodded slowly, but he did not look convinced. He looked thoughtful. Velmer stared at the human for a long moment. In 600 years of teaching, he had seen many young soldiers. He had watched them learn, fight, and sometimes die. He had seen bravery and cowardice, genius and foolishness. But in David Park's eyes, he saw something he had never seen before. He saw a human who did not believe in impossible. The lesson continued for another hour, but David barely heard any of it. His mind was already racing, already calculating, already planning. The other cadets accepted Velmer's words as truth. The void collapse could not be stopped. It was a law of nature, like gravity or time. But David Park had grown up on Earth, where humans had spent their entire history being told what they could not do. They could not fly. They could not go to space. They could not split the atom. They could not cure diseases. Every single time, someone had proven the doubters wrong. As the cadets filed out of Training Chamber 7, David stayed in his seat, staring at the hologram of empty space where the void collapse had been. His datapad was full of notes, but his mind was full of something more dangerous. A plan. Tommy Lee had known David Park for 2 years. They had met on the transport ship coming to the academy. 2 young humans surrounded by aliens who looked at them like they were insects. They had become friends quickly, the way humans do when they are far from home and surrounded by strangers. They shared a small room in the human quarters, ate meals together, and helped each other study for exams. But in the 3 weeks since Velmer's lesson about the void collapse, Tommy had barely seen his friend at all. It started small. David would stay up late, reading something on his datapad with the brightness turned down low. Then he started skipping meals, saying he was not hungry. Then he stopped coming back to their room at night entirely. Tommy found him one morning in the academy's library. A massive circular room filled with floating data crystals that held the knowledge of 1,000 civilizations. David was sitting in a corner, surrounded by holographic screens showing equations and diagrams that Tommy could not understand. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. His uniform was wrinkled and stained with coffee. "You look terrible," Tommy said, sitting down across from him. David did not look up from his screens. "I found something." "You found a way to fail all your tactical simulations," Tommy replied. "Commander Williams asked me where you were yesterday. I had to lie and say you were sick." "I found something important," David repeated, his voice distant and distracted. Tommy leaned forward and grabbed David's arm, forcing his friend to look at him. "Talk to me. What is going on with you?" For a moment, David seemed to come back to reality. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and let out a long breath. Then he turned one of his screens toward Tommy. It showed a diagram of the void collapse. The focal point that Velmer had mentioned was highlighted in red, a tiny dot at the center of expanding chaos. "Velmer said the focal point exists for 1 microsecond," David said quietly. "But he was wrong. I went through the Academy's archives, found every recorded void collapse in history, and analyzed the sensor data. The focal point actually exists for 1.7 microseconds. Tommy stared at him. "That is still almost nothing." "It is 70% more time than they thought," David said, and for the first time in weeks, there was energy in his voice. "That changes everything. With 70% more time, the calculations become possible." "Difficult, but possible. Calculations for what?" David pulled up another screen. This one showed a weapon design, a long cylindrical device covered in complex machinery. Tommy recognized some of the components. Gravitational generators, temporal stabilizers, a core that looked like it was meant to hold a small black hole. "Is that a singularity lens?" Tommy asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "A modified version," David confirmed. "The original design was created by the Volcae about 2,000 years ago. It was meant to be used against enemy planets. You fire it at a target, and it creates a brief gravitational singularity that tears everything apart." "It was banned," Tommy said. "It is illegal in 47 systems. The Coalition destroyed all the existing ones centuries ago." "They destroyed them because they were unstable," David said. "The original design had a flaw. The singularity would sometimes expand uncontrollably and destroy the ship that fired it. But I think I fixed that flaw." Tommy stood up and stepped back from the table. His heart was beating fast, and not in a good way. "David, what are you planning to do?" David looked at his friend with calm, steady eyes. "I am going to build a weapon that can stop a void collapse." "That is insane. Maybe." "No, listen to me," Tommy said, keeping his voice low so the library's monitoring systems would not pick up their conversation. "Even if you could build this thing, even if it worked, you would be thrown out of the Academy. You would be arrested. The Coalition takes weapons violations very seriously. I know. Then why are you doing this?" David was quiet for a moment. He turned back to his screens, looking at the diagram of the void collapse. When he spoke, his voice was soft. "My grandfather was on the colony ship Horizon 7, he said. It was one of humanity's first attempts to settle another planet. 3,000 people, including my grandmother and my father, who was just a baby at the time." Tommy said nothing. He had never heard David talk about his family before. They were 2 days away from their destination when the sensors detected a void collapse, David continued. The ship's captain made a choice. He put everyone under the age of 18 in the emergency escape pods and launched them before the collapse reached the ship. "Your father survived," Tommy said quietly. "My father survived," David confirmed. "My grandmother did not. My grandfather did not. 2,700 adults died that day, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. They just had to stand there and wait for the universe to erase them." David turned to look at Tommy. and there was something hard in his eyes now. Something fierce. "I am not going to let that happen to anyone else," he said. "Not if I can stop it." Tommy wanted to argue. He wanted to tell his friend that this was foolish, dangerous, and probably impossible. But looking at David's face, he knew that nothing he said would make a difference. "What do you need?" Tommy asked finally. David blinked in surprise. "What?" "I asked what you need." "To build this thing." "What do you need?" For a moment, David just stared at him. Then a small smile crossed his face, the first smile Tommy had seen from him in weeks. "I need access to the engineering bay," David said. "The restricted section where they keep the gravitational equipment. And I need someone to cover for me with Commander Williams." Tommy sighed and shook his head. "I am going to regret this." "Probably," David agreed. "But thank you." Over the next 6 weeks, David worked in secret. Tommy helped him sneak into the restricted engineering bay at night, using access codes he had stolen from a careless Fenari instructor. The work was slow and dangerous. More than once, David nearly triggered the security systems. More than once, he burned himself on equipment that was too hot or too cold or too strange for human hands. But slowly, piece by piece, the weapon took shape. It was not pretty. It was rough and ugly, a collection of stolen parts held together with emergency welding and desperate hope. The targeting system was built from 3 broken navigation computers that David had repaired himself. The power core was a modified reactor from a training shuttle that had been scheduled for disposal. But when David ran the final tests, everything worked. The calculations were precise. The singularity would form exactly where he aimed it, last exactly as long as he needed it to, and collapse safely without destroying anything around it. In theory, David hid the weapon in the cargo bay of the Steadfast, a small patrol ship used for training exercises. He covered it with spare parts and marked it as broken equipment scheduled for recycling. No one would look twice at it. Then he waited. He did not have to wait long. 2 weeks later, the Academy announced the final examination for all cadets. A live fleet exercise near the Kepler boundary. 17 training ships, 300 cadets. Observed by veteran officers from across the coalition. David was assigned to the Steadfast as he walked to the ship on the morning of the exercise. Tommy fell into step beside him. "Is it ready?" Tommy asked quietly. David nodded. "It is ready. And if it does not work?" David did not answer. He just kept walking toward the ship, toward whatever was waiting for him in the darkness of space. Tommy watched him go, feeling a strange mix of fear and admiration. Either his friend was about to become a hero or a criminal. Maybe both. Either way, nothing would ever be the same again. The Kepler boundary was a region of space where 3 different star systems met. It was far from any planet, far from any station, far from anything that could be damaged if young cadets made mistakes. That was why the Academy used it for final examinations. 17 training ships floated in formation, their lights blinking against the endless darkness. Each ship carried between 10 and 20 cadets, supervised by experienced officers. The exercise was simple. The fleet would split into 2 teams and engage in simulated combat. Sensors would track hits and misses. At the end of the day, scores would be calculated, and the best performers would earn commendations. David stood at his station on the bridge of the Steadfast, checking his console for the 10th time. The ship was small, designed for quick patrols and scouting missions. It had a crew of 12, including Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Stone, who sat in the captain's chair with a stern expression on her face. Stone was a career officer, 40 years old, with short gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She had served in the coalition fleet for 15 years and had little patience for mistakes. When she looked at David, her expression made it clear that she expected him to do his job, and nothing more. Tommy sat at the co-pilot station, his fingers moving nervously across his controls. He kept glancing back at David, but David ignored him. There was nothing to do now but wait and hope. "All ships, this is command," a voice crackled over the communication system. "The exercise will begin in 5 minutes. Blue team will defend Sector 7. Red team will attempt to capture the marker beacon. Standard rules apply. Good luck to all." Stone turned to her crew. "We are on blue team. Our job is to protect the beacon. Cadet Park, monitor the sensors. Cadet Lee, prepare for evasive maneuvers. Everyone else, battle stations." The crew moved quickly and efficiently. David watched his sensor screen, seeing the 17 ships as small dots of light. Half of them were moving away, heading to attack positions. The other half were forming a defensive line around the beacon. The exercise began. Ships flew through space, firing simulated weapons at each other. Lights flashed. Alarms beeped. Officers shouted orders while cadets scrambled to follow them. David did his job, calling out enemy positions and tracking incoming attacks. But part of his mind was somewhere else, waiting for something that probably would not happen. The chance of a void collapse occurring at this exact location, at this exact time, was incredibly small. He knew that. He had calculated the odds himself, but the universe did not care about odds. 20 minutes into the exercise, David's sensor screen flickered. He frowned, tapping the console to clear what he assumed was an error. But the flicker happened again, and this time it was accompanied by a reading that made his blood run cold. "Lieutenant Commander," David said, his voice steady despite his pounding heart, "I am detecting an anomaly in Sector 12. Stone glanced at him with annoyance. "An anomaly? What kind of anomaly?" "Spatial distortion. The readings are—" David paused, checking his numbers 3 times to make sure he was right. "The readings are consistent with the early stages of a void collapse." The bridge went silent. Every crew member turned to look at David with expressions of shock and disbelief. "That is impossible," Stone said firmly. "There has not been a void collapse in this region for over 200 years. "I know," David replied, "but the readings are clear. I am sending them to your console now." Stone looked at her screen, and David watched the color drain from her face. She hit the communication button immediately. "Command, this is Steadfast. We are detecting a possible void collapse forming in Sector 12. Request confirmation." There was a pause. Then the voice of the command ship's captain came through, tight with fear. "Confirmed, Steadfast. All sensors are showing the same readings. All ships, emergency evacuation. Repeat, emergency evacuation. Get out of the area immediately." Chaos erupted across the fleet. Ships that had been fighting each other moments ago now turned and ran, engines burning at maximum power. But David was already doing the math in his head, and the numbers were not good. "We cannot make it," he said quietly. Stone heard him. "What did you say, Cadet?" "The collapse radius," David explained, pointing at his screen. "Based on the energy readings, the radius will be at least 50,000 kilometers. Our maximum speed is not enough to escape in 43 seconds. None of the ships can escape." Stone stared at him, then at the numbers on her own screen. Her jaw tightened. She knew he was right. "All ships, this is command." The voice came again, and now it was shaking. "Evacuation is not possible. The collapse radius is too large. May the stars guide us all." Around the fleet, different species reacted in different ways. The Fenari began to sing, a beautiful and sad melody that their people had created for facing death. The Groth went completely still. Their humming stopped, accepting their fate with the quiet dignity of their culture. The Velkai spoke rapid prayers in their clicking language. On the Steadfast, some of the crew members started crying. Others sat frozen at their stations, unable to move. Stone gripped the arms of her chair, her face pale but calm. 30 seconds to collapse, the ship's computer announced in a pleasant, emotionless voice. David was already running. He sprinted off the bridge and down the corridor toward the cargo bay. Behind him, he heard Stone shouting for him to stop, to return to his station, but he ignored her. There was no time to explain. There was barely any time at all. He reached the cargo bay and threw aside the pile of spare parts covering his weapon. The Singularity lance sat underneath, ugly and rough and beautiful all at once. He grabbed it and ran to the nearest airlock, connecting it to the emergency weapons mount on the hull. 20 seconds, the computer announced. David's hands were shaking as he connected the power cables. The weapon hummed to life, and lights began to blink across its surface. The targeting system came online, searching for the focal point of the void collapse. Tommy appeared at the cargo bay door, out of breath. "David, what are you doing?" "Help me," David said, not looking up from his work. "I need someone to manually adjust the firing angle. The automatic system is not precise enough." Tommy hesitated for only a second. Then he ran to David's side and grabbed a manual control lever. 15 seconds. Stone's voice came over the ship's intercom. "Cadet Park, this is a direct order. Stop whatever you are doing and return to the bridge immediately." David did not respond. His eyes were fixed on the targeting display, watching the focal point of the void collapse appear as a tiny red dot among a sea of chaos. 10 seconds. The weapon was fully charged now. The Singularity generator was spinning at maximum speed, creating a point of infinite gravity inside the containment field. If the field failed, the weapon would destroy the ship instantly. But if it worked, target acquired, David whispered. 5 seconds. Tommy looked at his friend. "David, 4 seconds. If this does not work." 3 seconds. "Thank you for being my friend." 2 seconds. David pressed the firing button. The Singularity lance discharged with a sound that should not have been possible in the vacuum of space. It was not just loud. It was everywhere. A vibration that passed through the hull, through the air, through the bodies of everyone on board. David felt it in his bones, in his teeth, in the deepest parts of his brain. For one eternal moment, nothing happened. The focal point of the void collapse hung in space, untouched. The collapse continued to expand, reaching toward the fleet with invisible fingers of destruction. Then, the Singularity hit dot. It was like watching a bubble pop in reverse. The expanding chaos of the void collapse suddenly stopped, shivered, and then folded in on itself. The focal point shattered like glass, sending waves of distorted light in every direction. The collapse tried to continue, tried to reach out and erase reality. But without its anchor point, it had nothing to hold onto. It died. The universe, which had been about to lose a small piece of itself, remained whole, on the bridge of the Steadfast. The sensor screens went blank, then slowly came back to life. Where there had been warnings of imminent death, there was now only empty space and the confused signals of 17 ships that had no idea what had just happened. Stone stared at her screens for a long moment. Then she stood up and walked slowly toward the cargo bay, where a human cadet and his friend were sitting on the floor, too exhausted to move. "Cadet Park," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did you do?" David looked up at her, his face pale, his hands burned from the heat of the weapon. The Singularity lance beside him had melted into a lump of useless metal, never to fire again. "Something impossible," he said. "I did something impossible." The Steadfast was the last ship to return to the Academy. It flew slowly, surrounded by 2 military cruisers that had been sent to escort it, or guard it. David was not sure which word was more accurate, When the ship docked, armed security officers were waiting. They did not point their weapons at anyone, but the message was clear. David was escorted off the ship separately from the rest of the crew and taken to a holding room deep inside the station. The room was small and empty, except for a table and 2 chairs. The walls were gray metal, and there was no window. David sat in one of the chairs and waited. His hands had been treated by a medical officer during the flight back, wrapped in white bandages that still smelled like medicine. The burns were not serious, but they hurt enough to remind him of what he had done. Hours passed. No one came to talk to him. No one brought him food or water. He sat alone with his thoughts, wondering if he had made the right choice. He had broken at least 12 coalition laws. He had built an illegal weapon on Academy property. He had stolen parts from restricted storage. He had fired that weapon without authorization from any commanding officer. Any one of these crimes could result in years in prison. Together, they could mean the end of his career and possibly his freedom. But 304 people were alive because of what he did. 17 ships had not been erased from existence. Families across the galaxy would not receive messages telling them their children had disappeared into nothing. Was it worth it? David thought so. But he knew the coalition might not agree. The door finally opened, and Lieutenant Commander Stone walked in. She looked tired, her uniform wrinkled and her hair slightly out of place. She sat down across from David and stared at him for a long moment without speaking. "I have been in the military for 15 years, she said finally. "I have seen combat. I have lost friends. I have made difficult decisions that kept me awake at night. But I have never, in all my years of service, seen anything like what you did today." David said nothing. He waited. "The Coalition Command is arguing about what to do with you," Stone continued. "Some of them want to give you a medal. Others want to throw you in prison. A few think you should be executed." "Executed?" David repeated, surprised. "You built a weapon that was banned centuries ago," Stone said. "A weapon that has destroyed entire planets. Some members of the Coalition believe that anyone capable of building such a thing is too dangerous to live." David felt a chill run down his spine, but he kept his face calm. "What do you believe?" Stone leaned back in her chair and studied him carefully. "I believe you are either the bravest person I have ever met or the most reckless. Maybe both." She paused. "I also believe that I owe you my life, along with everyone else on that fleet. I did not do it for thanks," David said. "I know. That is what worries me." Stone stood up and walked to the door. "The official inquiry will begin tomorrow. You will be questioned by representatives from every species in the Coalition. I suggest you get some rest. It is going to be a very long few months." She was right. The inquiry lasted exactly 3 months and 12 days. David was questioned in a massive chamber at the center of the Academy. Representatives from all 17 Coalition species sat in a circle around him, their faces ranging from curious to hostile to completely unreadable. He told his story from the beginning, explaining how he had found the error in the focal point calculations, how he had designed and built the weapon, how he had made the decision to fire. The questions came at him like attacks. "Why did you not report your findings to your superiors?" "Because they would not have believed me." "How did you know the weapon would work?" "I did not know for certain. I calculated the probability and decided the risk was worth taking." "What gave you the right to make that decision alone?" "Nothing. I simply made it because no one else would." Some of the representatives were sympathetic. The Fenari, who valued life above all else, spoke in David's defense. They argued that saving 300 lives was more important than following rules that were created for normal situations. The Growth, who respected courage and strength, also supported him. They said that David had shown the true spirit of a warrior by facing impossible odds and refusing to surrender. But others were furious. The Volkai, who had created the original Singularity Lance and had spent centuries trying to bury that mistake, demanded harsh punishment. They argued that David had opened a door that should have remained closed forever. If humans were willing to build forbidden weapons whenever they decided it was necessary, how could the Coalition ever trust them? The debate went on for weeks. David sat through every session, answering every question, defending every decision. At night, he returned to his small holding room and lay awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering how his life had come to this. Tommy visited him whenever the guards allowed it. He brought news from the academy, telling David how the other cadets were reacting to the story. Most of the humans supported him, proud that one of their own had done something so extraordinary. The alien cadets were more divided, their opinions shaped by their species' history and values. Instructor Velmer asked about you, Tommy said during one visit. David looked up with surprise. Velmer? What did he say? He said you were the most interesting student he had ever taught. He also said you were probably insane. Tommy smiled slightly. I think it was a compliment. On the final day of the inquiry, David was brought before the full Coalition Council. This was not just academy officials or military representatives. These were the leaders of civilizations, beings who controlled entire star systems and made decisions that affected billions of lives. The chief science officer of the Coalition spoke first. He was ancient, even by alien standards, a being of pure energy contained in a crystalline shell. He had witnessed the birth and death of stars. He had seen species rise and fall across millennia. And now he was looking at a 22-year-old human from a planet that had only discovered space travel a few centuries ago. David Park of Earth, the chief science officer said, his voice filling the chamber without any apparent source. You have been charged with numerous violations of Coalition law. The evidence against you is clear and undeniable. You built an illegal weapon. You used stolen materials. You acted without authorization. David stood straight and waited for the verdict. However, the chief science officer continued, the results of your actions are also clear and undeniable. You prevented a void collapse. You saved 304 lives. You achieved something that has been considered impossible for 10,000 years. The chamber was completely silent. Every being in the room was focused on the ancient figure of light and crystal. The council has debated your case extensively. We have considered every argument, every precedent, every possible consequence. And we have reached a decision. David held his breath. You will not be punished for your actions. You will not be rewarded either. Instead, you will be given a choice. A choice? David asked. You have proven that the void collapse can be stopped. Your weapon worked, but it was crude, unstable, and impossible to reproduce. We want you to help us build something better. The chief science officer moved closer, his energy form pulsing with something that might have been curiosity. We are offering you a position in the Coalition's Advanced Research Division. You will work with the greatest scientists of every species to develop a defense against the void collapse that can be used by anyone, anywhere. David blinked. Of all the outcomes he had imagined, this was not one of them. And if I refuse? He asked. Then you will return to your academy training and complete your education like any other cadet. Your record will be sealed, and this incident will never be mentioned again. The chief science officer paused. But we hope you will not refuse. The galaxy needs people who can see beyond the impossible. The galaxy needs humans. David thought about his grandfather, standing on the bridge of the Horizon 7, watching the void collapse approach, and knowing there was nothing he could do. He thought about his father, a baby in an escape pod, surviving because someone had made a desperate choice in the face of certain death. He thought about all the ships that would encounter void collapses in the future. All the people who would die because no one had found a way to save them. "I accept," David said. The chief science officer nodded, light rippling through his crystalline form. "Welcome to the beginning of something new, David Park. Welcome to the future." 10 years passed. David Park stood at the window of Research Station Prime, looking out at the stars. He was 32 years old now, his hair starting to show touches of gray at the temples, his face carrying lines that had not been there when he was a young cadet. But his eyes were the same, still filled with that calculating intensity that had made Instructor Velmer call him the most interesting student he had ever taught. The research station floated at the edge of known space, far from any populated system. It was massive, bigger than most cities, and it was home to the greatest scientific project in Coalition history. 3,000 researchers from every species worked here, all focused on a single goal: perfecting the technology that David had first created in a stolen cargo bay with burned hands and desperate hope. They called it the Park Shield. David had not wanted them to name it after him. He had argued that it was a team effort, that hundreds of brilliant minds had contributed to turning his crude prototype into something that actually worked. But the Coalition Council had insisted. They said the galaxy needed heroes, needed symbols, needed to remember that sometimes one person really could make a difference. The door behind him opened, and Tommy Lee walked in. He was a captain now, commanding his own ship, but he still visited David whenever his duties brought him to this part of space. They had remained close over the years, their friendship forged in those desperate seconds when they had faced death together. "The final tests are complete," Tommy said, holding a datapad. "Every single one was successful. The mass production facilities are ready. The Coalition is preparing to install park shields on every ship in the fleet." David nodded slowly. "How many shields?" "Over 50,000 to start. More will be built every year." Tommy walked to stand beside his friend at the window. "You did it, David. You really did it." "We did it," David corrected. "I just started something. Thousands of people finished it. Still." Tommy smiled. Not bad for a kid from Earth who did not know when to give up. They stood in silence for a while, watching the stars. Somewhere out there, ships were traveling between worlds. Families were living their lives. Children were being born and growing up and dreaming about the future. And soon, all of them would be a little bit safer because of what had happened in this station. "I got a message from the Academy yesterday," David said eventually. "They asked me to come back and give a lecture." "About the park shield?" "About the void collapse." David turned to look at his friend. "They want me to teach the new cadets what I taught myself all those years ago. That impossible is just a word. That if you think something cannot be done, you are probably looking at it wrong." Tommy raised an eyebrow. "Are you going to do it?" "I think so. I think it is important." David walked to his desk and picked up a small object. It was a piece of melted metal, twisted and blackened by heat. The last remaining fragment of his original Singularity lance. He had kept it all these years as a reminder. When I was sitting in that classroom, listening to Velmer explain why the void collapse could not be stopped, I remember thinking that he was wrong. Not because I was smarter than him. Not because I had some special knowledge he did not have. But because he had stopped asking questions. He had accepted that the problem could not be solved, so he stopped trying to solve it. David set the fragment down and looked at Tommy. "That is what I want to teach those cadets. Never stop asking questions. Never accept that something is impossible just because everyone says it is. Because sometimes the only difference between impossible and possible is someone stubborn enough to try." The lecture took place 3 weeks later. David stood in Training Chamber 7. The same room where Instructor Velmer had told him about the void collapse all those years ago. The seats were filled with new cadets, young faces from dozens of different species. Humans sat among them now, no longer rare or strange, accepted as full members of the coalition. Velmer was there too, sitting in the back of the room. His crystalline body was older now, his light slightly dimmer, but his presence was still commanding. He had requested permission to attend, and David had been honored to have him. Today, David began, "I am going to tell you a story. It is a story about a young cadet who was told that something was impossible. And it is a story about what happened when that cadet decided not to believe it." He talked for 2 hours. He told them about finding the error in the focal point calculations. He told them about building the weapon in secret, about the fear and doubt he had felt, about the moment when he had pressed the firing button with no real certainty that it would work. He told them about the inquiry, the debates, the difficult questions he had faced, and he told them about the years that followed. The research, the failures, the breakthroughs. The moment when the first production park shield was tested and worked perfectly. The celebrations that had spread across the galaxy as news of the discovery reached world after world. When he finished, the room was silent. Then, slowly, the cadets began to applaud. Aliens and humans together, clapping and stomping and making whatever sounds their species used to show appreciation. David waited for the noise to die down. Then he asked a question. When you are out there, somewhere in the galaxy, and you face something that everyone tells you is impossible, what are you going to do? A young human cadet in the front row raised her hand. She looked nervous but determined, her eyes bright with something that David recognized. He had seen it in his own mirror years ago. "Ask questions," she said. "Keep trying. Find a way." David smiled. "That is right. Never give up. Never accept impossible. Because the galaxy is full of problems that no one has solved yet. And maybe, just maybe, you will be the one to solve them." After the lecture, Velmer approached David in the corridor, the ancient crystal being moved slowly, but his voice was still strong. "You have changed things," Velmer said. "Not just with your technology. You have changed how the coalition thinks. For thousands of years, we accepted certain truths. We believed we understood the limits of what was possible. You proved us wrong." "I just asked a question that no one else was asking," David replied. "That is exactly my point." Velmer's body flickered with light that might have been amusement. "Humans have been part of the coalition for barely a generation. You are children, by our standards. But perhaps that is your strength. You have not lived long enough to learn what cannot be done." David thought about that for a moment. Maybe, or maybe everyone can think this way, if they choose to. Maybe impossible is just a habit that gets stronger the longer you practice it. Perhaps. Velmer began to move away, then paused. "I will tell you something I have never told any student. David Park, when I taught that lesson about the void collapse all those years ago, I saw the look in your eyes. I saw that you did not believe me. And do you know what I felt? Fear?" David guessed. "Hope," Velmer said. "For the first time in centuries, I felt hope. Because I knew that if anyone could prove me wrong, it would be someone who looked at the impossible and simply refused to accept it." The old instructor turned and walked away, leaving David alone in the corridor. Years later, when David was old and his work was done, he would think back to that conversation. He would think about all the cadets he had trained, all the scientists he had worked with, all the lives that had been saved by the park shield. And he would realize that the most important thing he had ever done was not building a weapon or stopping a void collapse. It was teaching others to believe that impossible was just another word for not yet. In every academy across the coalition, new instructors taught new cadets. And when they discussed problems that seemed unsolvable, challenges that seemed too great, threats that seemed unstoppable, they always ended with the same question: what would the humans do? The answer, every single time, was the same: load the weapon anyway. because somewhere in the galaxy, in the hearts of beings from every species, a small voice now whispered that maybe, just maybe, impossible was not as permanent as it seemed. And that voice, more than any technology or weapon or discovery, was the greatest gift humanity had ever given to the stars.